Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com, where you'll find in-depth reporting and other resources concerning every topic discussed right here on the podcast. San Antonio Express News staff writer Scott Huddleston has been covering the proposed plan to make changes to Alamo Plaza and joins me today with updates on how that plan has changed and where it currently stands in the process of being eventually approved and implemented. So, Scott, great to have you back here on the program for the second time, I believe. Let's start with the most recent action on this plan that took place earlier this week. What happened?
Well, so earlier this week, what we call the Alamo Management Committee approved the plan, which carried it forward in the next step. And so it's just cleared the second hurdle before there are many more hurdles to get through before it actually is a plan that the Alamo Endowment, a nonprofit foundation, can begin raising money for.
Now, from what I understand, this most recent approval, and it is kind of interesting because you use the word approval in all these different jumps that this plan has to take to eventually getting implemented, but it has not been approved yet. We'll get more into that. But there was also something for the plan last week that ended up resulting in people actually being ejected from a meeting when the plan was endorsed. So can you tell me what happened last week?
Yeah, that was really quite a big event and a major juncture in the whole process for this plan. So there was a meeting of what we call the 30-member Alamo Citizen Advisory Committee, composed of different people from different backgrounds and segments in the community, including historians and in some cases just city council appointees from the 10 different districts of San Antonio. And they passed 7 resolutions supporting the plan. That includes such elements as closing streets to traffic, new parade routes, repair and relocation of the Cenotaph Monument, which is a monument honoring the Alamo defenders, access to the plaza during the day. There will be, handrails and that kind of thing to control foot traffic. Adaptive reuse of the buildings that could be used for a museum on the west end of Alamo Plaza, and an emphasis on adhering to state antiquities and state and health and safety codes and local codes. They just want to make sure that it follows the process. And last, the 7th resolution was a long-term lease between the city and the state to manage that plaza.
Now, obviously, at that meeting, some people were unhappy about what happened, and they were ejected. Could you tell me a little bit of detail about that?
So there are some folks who are really upset about the proposed relocation of the Cenotaph, feeling that it should remain where it is. And it's been there since 1940, so almost 80 years. And they were speaking during the meeting and kind of being a little bit disruptive. And the city councilman, Roberto Trevino, warned them that they would be removed from the council chambers if they did that again. And I think about 10 people were removed, but there was no kind of violence or anything like that. And people were escorted out by police without incident.
And I'm just guessing that as this plan moves forward, which we'll talk about here in a moment, that might not be the last time something like that happens in a public space. But as I just mentioned, as this plan moves forward, you talk about endorsements, you talk about approval. Could you just generally sketch what the trajectory is for something like this as it has to kind of go through all these different levels, all these different committees until eventually it might be approved sometime later this year? How does that work?
Well, it's going to be, there are going to be meetings done by phone, like the one the other day with the management committee, where they're not held in the public, and it will be just the parties involved in those decisions deciding what to do, how to move forward. But there will be certain other meetings. For example, the city's Historic and Design Review Commission will have an open public meeting where citizens will be allowed to speak. And so will our city's Planning Commission. That will occur as well before it goes to City Council, which, of course, that also is a public meeting where citizens can speak. There are aspects of this plan that will go to the Texas Historical Commission, which meets in Austin, and citizens will have an opportunity to speak at those meetings as well. So some of the meetings occur with citizen input and some don't.
And is there some sort of overarching rule on why it has to go through all these different committees and why some of them are public and some of them aren't? Who's kind of putting this plan together?
This is a very unique project, although we see more of these so-called public-private projects being done. And so because it involves the city and the state, there are certain aspects of the project that have to come to public boards that adhere to the Open Meetings Act. And that's why citizens are allowed access to those meetings. But you've also got a lot of private fundraising, private involvement involved in this. So, you're talking about a $450 million project, and about at least $200 million of that will be raised privately under the plan. So there is a significant private component to that. So when you've got all these parties working together, it's kind of a unique process of its own.
And as you just mentioned, Scott, some of the upcoming meetings will be open to the public. People will be able to voice their opinion for support or in opposition of this plan to change Alamo Plaza. But that's also been the case in the recent past. And because of some of that input, I know the plan has changed. I think some people would say there hasn't been a lot of change, but there has been changes that have been made. How would you say the plan has been updated since we last spoke on the In-Depth podcast in June?
Regarding the issue of pedestrian access to the plaza, there have been 2 entry points to the north and south that have been added. In other words, during the day when the museum, the Alamo Museum, is operating, what we call Alamo Plaza will actually be functioning as kind of an outdoor museum to complement the indoor museum that's going to be built. And so, there have been a lot of San Antonians concerned about pedestrian access to that plaza because it's always been an open plaza. So the planners added 2 entry points to the north and south that will, work in conjunction with the primary entry point from the west. That's one of the issues that has changed. The other being that they've kind of massaged the whole issue about the parade routes and where the parades will go. And they've reached resolution on that issue with the 2 parade associations. And those are very large events held during our fiesta celebration during the spring. And I think that they've also made some headway trying to alleviate concerns about traffic and how that's going to be rerouted and how it could affect service deliveries to the businesses downtown.
Now, generally speaking, how do you think those recent changes have been received by both the community and business owners? Obviously, there are some people that are still against the plan and might be against the plan even if major changes are made. But the changes that you just mentioned based on the input at some of these past meetings, has that been received positively?
The parade routes, those issues have been resolved. There still are a lot of concerns about pedestrian access to the plaza, how the plaza functions in compared to how it has functioned in the past, let's say, 150 years. And then there also is a very strong vocal opposition to relocating the cenotaph from the people who feel that it needs to stay right where it is. The other issue is the buildings. What's going to happen to those buildings on the west side of the plaza? Because, there are a lot of questions that remain unanswered as to whether they can function as a museum. And so how they can be reused, if they can be reused, or whether it would be better to demolish them, that is a big issue that's looming as we move forward.
Now, Scott, we have several minutes left, and I want to make sure that you can tell me about this special event that you participated in last month about this topic we're discussing now. Tell me about it.
So we had an event that we called Headlines and Hops at the Alamo Beer Brewery on August 15th, and I was one of the participants along with Elaine Ayala, one of our Metro writers, and Ricardo Pimentel, our editorial page editor. And it was moderated by our editor, Mark Devoisin. And it was we had about 100 people, and it was sold out. And we had a really good crowd who were very engaged and listening about, interested in the history of the Alamo. But they were particularly wanting to know more about the mission era of that site and how it evolved into, from a Spanish colonial mission to a Spanish military fort, and then the place that we know as the Alamo, where there was this 13-day siege that ended in a famous early morning battle. And so it was a really good event, and I had a PowerPoint presentation that I showed at the early opening of that roughly 90-minute event, just to give people, a feeling for what we're talking about, because you have to understand the site visually in order to understand what we're really talking about with this Alamo plan. And so I went through about 25 images of what the battle might have looked like.
And then so at this event, Scott, there were people who had the opportunity to ask you and the other panelists about the proposed changes to the Alamo. I'm wondering what they had to say.
Well, they just wanted to know more about the details of this process and how it works, because it's so intricate and involved and multifaceted. And then some of them were just very interested in the PowerPoint, and they said, if nothing else, as a service to the community, just please put that PowerPoint on your website or something like that, so that people can understand visually what it is that we're talking about.
Before we wrap up, Scott, I have a few more questions, but I really, really would want to spend a little bit of time on the cenotaph, because that is such a huge point of contention for a lot of people, especially those, I think it's safe to say, who are against making changes. Specifically about the cenotaph, could you talk about the placement of that monument and whether or not that has actual historical significance?
So the artist who did the public art component of that monument, Pompeo Capini, had a proposal early on to put this monument by the Municipal Auditorium, which is elsewhere downtown, or in Travis Park. And then at some point when the project began to come to fruition, they were talking about putting it in the south end of Alamo Plaza. But toward the end of that, planning phase of the project, they decided we'll move it to the north end, and that's where it ended up. And so that's where people are used to seeing it and used to it being in, and it's inside what we call the historic footprint. In other words, it's in that area that once was enclosed by the outer walls of the Alamo fort or compound. And so to a lot of people, there's a real visceral connection with it being right there. In other words, it's in a place where a lot of the fighting and dying did occur on that morning of March 6, 1836. And so they feel that it should be right there. Now, the city, as part of this Alamo plan, had initially talked about moving the cenotaph about 2 blocks to the south, to close to our convention center, because it's long been believed that is where one of the funeral pyres was after the battle, where the defenders' bodies were burned. And so that was the rationale that, we could move it here where it has an authentic historical connection to something that happened after the battle. But then people were very upset about that proposal to move it 2 blocks away. And so the design team came back with what they called a compromise proposal to relocate the cenotaph outside of the historic footprint, but still within a direct line of sight of the iconic, what we call the Alamo Church, and still in that immediate area. So instead of moving 2 blocks, it would move about 500 feet.
And then as we wrap up now, Scott, I'd like to just reiterate a little bit about what's next for this plan to change Alamo Plaza in the coming weeks or the coming months, and then final thoughts before we say goodbye.
Well, the plan now goes to what we call the executive committee, which is a committee of 2 people in very important positions. Our Texas Land Commissioner, George P. Bush, and Mayor Ron Nierenberg. And either of those could have veto power to send the plan back to the management committee, or they could approve it. And that meeting could occur any day now. From that point on, the plan would go to those city review boards, the Historic and Design Review Board Commission and the Planning Commission, and then brought to City Council for a vote by the City Council. There also are components of that plan that have to go to the Texas Historical Commission, which would review the relocation of the cenotaph and any changes to those buildings that I've talked about. So there still are a lot of hurdles to go through. It's possible that there could be a plan approved as early as late November, and that would allow the Alamo Endowment to begin the private fundraising component.
And a big thank you to San Antonio Express News staff writer Scott Huddleston for joining me on today's episode of the In-Depth Podcast, an interview program from expressnews.com. Something tells me we might be speaking to Scott a little bit later in the fall as, of course, this plan to change Alamo Plaza moves forward. I think that would be a good use of our time. So look forward to that upcoming episode sometime soon at expressnews.com/podcasts. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.